And so Gurudaram talking about lean startup using Moqui and some other related tools. And I guess based on your experiences with startups, and 2 of them now. Yeah, turn it over to you.
I'll take it away. Thanks, David.
Yep.
My name is Guru Duttam Khalsa. Some people call me Khalsa, Guru, GD, hey, bro, all those kinds of things. So if you mess it up, I don't mind. I started using Moqui, I think in late 2018. I'll preface this whole presentation with, I'm not a programmer, but I do consider myself a technologist, and I love developing technology and working with software. In this presentation, we're going to cover technology first and then the business a little bit. And it's going to be fairly kind of quick, and I'm really open to questions. So if at any point you want to just unmute, ask a question, or in the room, throw out a question. I like being interrupted. It gives me a moment to rest and save my breath for a second. So getting started on the technology, this is, again, a quick, real dive into a lean startup. So I think that in a lean startup, you should really work to minimize the software that you use. Vince kind of said this earlier. Some organizations will have hundreds of different softwares they use to operate. Currently, what we use is Google Workspaces. You could use Nextcloud as an alternative. And in Google Workspaces, we use it to collaborate on docs, spreadsheets, email, Meet, all those kinds of things. And so we use it very extensively. And inside of there, it's always been very, very beneficial to adopt a fairly open document strategy, meaning share everybody on all your drives, give people access to as much information as possible. Don't worry about them stealing it or that kind of stuff, because it's much more important that you're successful than you worry about them stealing an idea from you. The second software, quote unquote, we use is AWS. And we started using AWS in maybe 2017 or so, primarily because we're getting to the financial services space, and AWS is SOC 2 and various other accreditations certified. And we knew that banks would allow us to use AWS to host their data. And so we really focused on it. And the other thing that I'll get into here is AWS provides something called managed services, which remove the system administrator role from your organization if you do it effectively. As far as software goes, we use Moqui, and I'll get into that a little bit more. We also use GitHub for hosting code. We tried using AWS Code Commit as an alternative and ran into some tough things with that. So GitHub is a fairly good place. And if you're going open source with your repo, GitHub is a great place, because a lot of people go there, and GitHub kind of gives a little bit of special preference to open source projects in a lot of ways. And the other software that we use is marketing. And it's important to kind of like think about your business and who you're targeting to, and tailor your marketing software to that. Previously, we used email with like MailChimp or various email services for marketing. Currently, I use social media platforms like Instagram for marketing, and there's billions of people on there actively using that app every day. So you want to think of how you're going to connect to these people. Email is one option, but there's other ways to put yourself in front of people's faces. Vince mentioned the AWS marketplace. There's a bunch of different marketplaces. So you got to think of how you're going to use software to market your product.
Question.
Yep.
You mentioned social media. Does that have something to do with the nature of the product as well as?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm building a consumer product targeting people who want to create entertainment content. So it is the platform of those people. Yeah, where creators are. It's not a business focused. People should market on LinkedIn. If you're marketing business products, you should take aggressive strategies to market on LinkedIn. There are people on social media, broadly calling it social media, and those platforms give you a voice, a free voice in a lot of cases, or a cheap voice in other cases, to market. Google Ads and stuff like that is a very expensive choice for marketing. And so until you've really dialed in, we tried running some ads in our startups, and I'm not going to say run Google ads here, because unless you really know who you're marketing to and you have a very strong advertising management team, you're going to lose a lot of money, like frankly, very quickly. And actually, I'm fairly against paid marketing until you really know what you're selling and you've sold it a lot. So don't start that way. But the main message here with the software is don't approve a lot of things in your organization. Say no. Early on in MK, we had people that were like, we want to use Trello, we want to use Jira. We used a software called Redmine, which is another great open source project management tool. But people just kept coming up with all these new software to use for this solution and that solution. Developers wanted to use this ID or that ID. We just told them no, and it worked out pretty well. And it especially works out really well if you get acquired, because acquiring companies don't really want to take on a lot of baggage, and they're going to make you use their software if they're larger. So you want to just be ready to like have a minimal footprint and move into the future. Good question. For hosting, again, we use Amazon Web Services, and I think there's going to be some other presentations that are going to get a little bit more into some different configurations in AWS. I'm happy to get involved in any questions about any of these AWS services, or if you're having trouble getting Moqui running in Amazon ECS, which is Elastic Container Service, kind of Docker images, you can talk to Michael. And so we use Amazon Route 53 for DNS, and typically I make AWS Route 53 the source of authority for our domain, even though our domains are registered with Google, because there's a tight integration with several different AWS resources like Certificate Manager or Amazon SES, which is for emails. And so it just makes setting those things up a lot easier. For networking, we use Amazon VPC, and there's a pretty minimal networking that I usually approach. Like, I'm not a network admin, so I try to keep it as simple as possible. I think that that's one place where people could improve or contribute, but that's it. We use an application load balancer, which is fairly easy to configure. There's some tips and tricks, and Michael is coming out with some documentation that will help people configure load balancers, security groups, target groups, all that kind of stuff. For the database, we used AWS Relational Database Service with Postgres. And the main reason for this is just research has shown that Postgres is the business database, open source business database of choice. You can use Maria or MySQL, but there's just benefits to Postgres. We got to put your face on camera here, Adam. We're getting some good scenes around here. It's some good preference for Postgres. And one thing that I would recommend when you're setting up a database server is start as small as possible and scale it up. Don't try to over provision, because you can always go up, but it's hard to go down. And so just like start with a minimal instance, minimal hard drive capacity, and then scale it up as you need. And we use another thing called Elastic File System, which attaches to the Elastic Container Service container for permanent local storage. And currently we're storing session data on Elastic File System. And so we're able to resume sessions on server restarts without clustering, is essentially the reason why we're using Elastic File Service. And we use Elastic Container Repository, or ECR, for storing images. So currently, and I actually didn't list this, but we use GitHub Actions to build an image, push it to Elastic Container Registry, and it sits there, and then ECS picks it up in a task definition. And then finally, and the reason why I listed it finally is we use ECS. And if you're setting up a system with Elastic Container Service, you will realize that you want to set that part up last. You need to get everything else set up and in place before you kind of set up your task definition. You can do it out of order, but you'll experience it yourself. And then a critical note here is it's very expensive to run OpenSearch servers relative to the rest of the setup. So Amazon Relational Database Service is one of the high costs. And then if you set up OpenSearch servers in a cluster, they're also a very high cost. And so if you can run those concurrently within your Moqui container, then you can save a lot of money. And as you're developing, you can see very minimal difference in performance. This is not necessarily a production setup. This is getting started and making sure you have kind of low burn. So one of the key things about all of these services is that they're AWS managed services. And I forgot to put in my Amazon responsibility model, but AWS managed services means that Amazon takes responsibility for the underlying hardware, the patching and maintenance of that. And you're really responsible for the configuration and the software that you run on it. And this puts a whole bunch of the liability of running servers on Amazon and takes it off of your shoulders. So ideally, you cannot have a system admin or network admin. No offense to anybody in the room, that's their thing. But I think all of us really want to focus on software and building software and not managing servers. And so this setup is designed to be lazy and smart. Lazy in the sense that we have very little server management. I'm not a programmer, and I manage our network, or I manage our infrastructure in most ways. I can see it, I can configure it, all that kind of stuff. And it's smart in that it's able to come back up if a server dies automatically without any assistance. And I don't have to do any patching or maintenance of those servers. Amazon takes care of all of it. So another point here in hosting is that redundancy costs money. In this setup, in prior companies and in current companies, there hasn't been a need for cross-region redundancy or any kind of advanced things which would double or triple the cost. And so as a startup, it's easy to imagine scale, but it's hard to get there. So you want to start off with something that costs you as little as possible, that you can test and build with, and then add redundancy when it's demanded and somebody's paying for it. That's really my message here. And the main message here at the bottom is keep your hosting costs as a startup, not generating revenue, absolutely under $300 a month. Michael has some documentation that will show you can do this whole setup for under 150 bucks a month or something like that. And so you really want to think about like how to minimize this cost. I've heard horror stories of companies spending $20,000 a month on hosting fees in development, no revenue, no nothing. And it's partially because they just let people set up servers and those servers run, and they didn't really focus on how to minimize their footprint and keep costs low. And as any kind of leader, founder, part of an organization, your burn is your lifeline. And if you don't keep it low, you're going to go. So the next part of this is something called going full Moqui. And it's something that I would really want to push onto the community over and over. And it's something that we didn't do in the first business. Like I mentioned, we use Redmine for project management. But in this new venture, we're using Moqui for project management. And Moqui actually has a totally sufficient out-of-the-box project management system that you can use as soon as you get your server up. And I fully recommend using the exact same server for your application as you do for your business operations internally, and design your whole application so that it separates that data and it's protected, but that your employees are using the same server to develop and to work. And this benefit means that people are signing into that server every day, so they see that it's up, but also you're able to leverage a lot of the business automation processes or ERP data across both sides of it. And you start getting familiar with Moqui and all the screens and all the data model and all those things when you start really focusing on using it for your day-to-day business management, in addition to building applications on it. The second part of going full Moqui, and I'm sure there's lots of people who have experienced this and still don't agree, is to use the Moqui UI and screens as much as possible or completely. And I'll say this in the inverse. Don't build a React application for the front end talking to Moqui on the back end. It's fairly excessive. It costs a lot of development delays and challenges. It also fragments your ecosystem so that you have to have developers specialized in that application software and in Moqui. And it causes ultimately a lot of challenges. And there's not a very good reason for it. Moqui does provide several different UI tool sets, primarily Quasar at this point, which is a material UI-based UI tooling, and it's great for building applications. You just got to understand how to build with it and tell your developers to build on top of Moqui UI. You can leverage a lot of the things. The third thing about going full Moqui is contributing. And so you want to build your application open source first and make sure that you're pushing as much of your code base upstream into the open source repositories and out to the community. And the benefits of contributing open source first, especially if you get your software into the open source main repositories, is that you reduce your code debt as an organization. And so anything that's in the main Moqui repos is supported by all of us as a community. And so you as a single point of failure have a lot less requirement to support that code. And the other reason is you can benefit humanity by contributing software. So in the previous company, we contributed very little open source, although Eamon's fixing that. In the current company, we started our repo on GitHub as public. It stayed public. And ultimately, David said, hey, you're public enough that we're going to take part of this code base into Moqui. And so we were able to deleverage part of our code base and bring it into the community over time. And although it's not completely there, eventually it'll pay off exponentially. Any questions about going full Moqui? Or?
You might just elaborate a little bit on that last point of what exactly it was that you had out there as open source that's getting absorbed into the main.
Yeah, and you can go into the Moqui GitHub. There's a new component called We Create. And so We Create it's kind of like a consumer application, but it could be used for businesses too. And the point is to take like an Instagram approach. But if you look at every single social media, they are all designed the same way, where we want to provide feed, search, create stuff, your profile, messaging, and a couple of different tools inside of an application. So that's what it does.
And in that example, it wasn't just taking some code like the good framework as an example or something. It was truly like a whole repository you had out there. It's now being brought in under the umbrella of Moqui as a service.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so Michael and I started working on this probably 7 or 8 months ago, something like that. Somewhere 6 months ago. And first we created a component that was under resist management, independent of Moqui. And it had all of the code for the application and a little bit of our branding and stuff like that. And so we worked on it, and I've worked with David several times, so he's very familiar with it. And then we, once David decided to bring it into Moqui, we've started separating the things that would be generic and putting that into the We Create component, and the things that are like proprietary, like our logo, for example. And ideally, our personal component will end up being very limited. It'll be like data that's specific to our organization, seed data, and then our theme, resources, and logo, maybe website stuff, like website screens that are marketing websites. So it was a process of first starting out, putting everything in that repo, making it public, letting people see it, and then later identifying that it could be used for other people. And then it's a lot easier to separate it out when you've already committed to making it all public. It's a lot easier to just say like copy it all, and for other people to copy it all. I don't know if I answered that quite, but yeah.
I think the reason I asked that distinction was to clarify, like contributing as like a pull request or something to an existing repository versus something like this is.
This is a kind of a newer, yeah, I'll elaborate a little bit. So definitely for contributing to existing repositories and making improvements, but this is like starting a company and starting open source first. So you just kind of put it all in there and get people ready to unleash it.
Yeah, one quick note on that. It's like a full application. So and ended up going in we discussed this, but ended up going in a separate repository. So a plain pull request wasn't quite adequate for for the scope of it. But yeah, as Guru Dharam was saying, it was created in a and this I think is a good pattern, but it's created in a GitHub repository, or Git repository elsewhere is fine too, but under their own account. And then we started working together on it from there to kind of bring it under the Moqui umbrella. And not that everything has to go that way, but that's a good place to start anyway, like you've done as well, Vince, kind of creating under open repositories.
Yeah, and one of the side benefits of creating it as a public open source repository is if you do engage consultants or third parties, it's a lot easier for them to just go in and grab the code. You don't have to kind of like worry about giving them access to everything and setting them up. And you're also a lot less defensive, like emotionally, intellectually. You're not like, oh, I'm going to lose this part of the code. You're like, I want them to take it and I want them to use it and tell me how bad it is or how good it is. And I want to be very open about it. So it's a very different approach.
Code is a liability.
Yeah, code is a liability. And so when you have a community supporting code, it's a shared liability. And a shared liability is, for non-programmers, much better than your own, right? Especially as founders. Yeah, good points. All right, so now we're going to start talking about starting a lean business. And the reason why I kind of put that technology side first is I think it's incredibly important to get your technology set up, to get your Moqui server running, to get your Google Spaces set up, and then start developing your application. But you got to do all those cheap enough that you're not afraid to do that. That's part of the point there. So you should be spending, less than $100 to $200 a month. So you're not really super afraid of that stuff running. So some of the basics of a lean startup is something called a lean canvas, which is here, and you can Google it. And a lean canvas really helps identify like what you're going after in this business and how you're going to achieve it. So if you look at these numbers, they're not from left to right. They're all out of order. Why the lean canvas creators put it in this way, I don't know, but they did. But really, you focus first on who are your customers and what's the problem you're solving. Often as technologists, we can come up with a great idea that we're not sure who needs it. And it's called an idea chasing a market. And that's pretty easy to do, and it wastes a lot of money. And you generally want a market and you want to develop a product that solves a problem for that market. So this lean canvas helps people do that. And you take this and you remove all the intermediate words and you just take the bold stuff like customer segment, early adopters, problem, existing alternatives, and you actually write out as much as you can about how you're going to fulfill all these different things. And these are like really high level fill in the blank kind of things. So you don't need to spend like more than 2 hours filling this out. And if you can't really fill out some part of every one of these boxes in a few hours, then you don't really understand your customer or your business enough. And it's important that you recognize that and then focus on that before developing software. So it's really important to understand like who you're going after and what they need and what they're going to pay for it before you spend money developing your software. The second part of being lean is controlling your burn. And for anybody that doesn't know, burn is basically your revenue minus your costs. And so in other words, it's your net income per month or per quarter or per year, whatever you want to look at it in. And if your net income is negative consistently, you need to borrow or raise money to fulfill that. One way to control your burn is to be a one-person company and not pay yourself. And it's fairly easy to control that burn if you can afford it, or if you can have a second job and do this on the side. So it's really important to kind of really understand your business before you hire expensive people is my point here. And so you really want to control that burn. And it's very important to launch an MVP for, I'm throwing out a number here, under $50,000 in total expense. So your development, your hosting, your admin, your marketing, whatever, make sure you're launching for a reasonable number, because I've seen too many companies just invest tens of millions of dollars pre-MVP and they often fail. It's really the reason here. So the more you can control your burn, the more you can last as a company. And the final point here is leverage friends and resources. I was fortunate enough, my dad's company is a CPA firm, so they did free accounting and financial consulting for us for the whole start of MK. Separately, back in 2018, I found this person that had invented Moqui called David Jones, and I hounded him to the end of the earth to start forming a communication channel, because I knew that it would be important to kind of grow my ability to deliver software here. And that led to working with Michael and ultimately Eamon and lots of different people. So it's really important as a community, as a Moqui community, if you want to be lean, to leverage each other. And a lot of technologists are a little antisocial or a little conservative, not socially conservative, but like conservative, and they don't want to ask for a lot of things. But if you want to succeed as a startup, you need to leverage people. And you need to be aggressively looking at how other people can help you stay afloat, succeed and get ahead, whether it's them buying your product, marketing your product, telling you all the good or bad things about your product, or helping you develop it. It's very important to leverage friends and family. All right. So if you're starting to form a business plan, and I'm not a super big fan of very detailed business plans, although they do work for some people, but it's really important to identify why are you starting this business? And a lot of people start it for personal passion. They love what they're doing. Some people start it because they just want to innovate and they see a problem and they think they can do it better. And other people are money hungry. And rarely do money hungry people succeed unless they have a technical skill, from what I've seen, because they ultimately don't have the ability to deliver and convince people to help them deliver at reasonable costs. They see big numbers and they build their whole model off of big numbers, and big numbers get scary real fast. And we're about to see tons of bankruptcies throughout the technology industry right now. It's about to happen. A lot of consolidation is about to happen. So I would emphasize in this YU, if you're not really personally passionate about what you're getting into, you may have a lot of difficulty in this startup, because it takes personal passion and it takes going through a lot of difficulty to make sure that you see it through to then. You're going to be in a lot of circumstances where you don't have enough money. You have to tell people you can't pay them. Like vendors, you have to stretch them out 60, 90 days or whatever, and they're going to be pissed at you because they need that money. So it's important to like have that personal connection and commitment to this. And then if you also have this motivation of, I want to innovate, and you have a reason to innovate, it can also help drive yourself and people forward. The next part of business plan, if you're just keeping it simple, is customer acquisition cost versus lifetime value. And the definition is there, but the concept is it costs something to acquire every customer, whether it's marketing costs, salesperson costs, or your own time. And if you want to scale a business, it will either cost marketing costs or salesperson costs, because things don't just sell themselves typically. The lower you can get a customer acquisition cost, like say Gmail in the earlier days where people were just referring it left and right because it was the email software, that's a low customer acquisition cost. It's word of mouth. It costs like nothing. Versus lifetime value, you can be successful. They didn't need to have a lot of lifetime value. They didn't need to charge for the product at first because they had cheap servers, low acquisition costs, and they were able to just scale. And even though they made like tiny amounts of ad revenue off of it, they could keep going, and it was successful. So focus initially when you're building this business plan on these two metrics alone. Like just figure out what your customer acquisition cost is going to be conceptually in the short run, in the medium run, and in the long run, and figure out what your lifetime value is going to be from this customer. And if they don't pan out, you're never going to succeed. If your lifetime value is less than your customer acquisition cost, you will never succeed as a business fundamentally. And it's fairly often that people don't acknowledge that or understand that. They don't look at the lifetime value of a customer, and they don't really understand their customer acquisition costs. To give you an example, if you're a business banking software and your solution costs, let's say like $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year, you're trying to sell people on 3 to 5 year deals. Some will renew, some won't. Let's say it's a 3-year deal. You have $180,000 of revenue from that customer. That's not their value. There's cost of hosting them. There's all kinds of other stuff. So if 50% of those renew, you may have a $270,000 revenue, 180 plus 90,000, $270,000 revenue, just big numbers, doing it easy from that customer. The present value of that may only be like 100, 150,000. So if a salesperson costs you $150,000 a year and they only sell one a year, you are not making money. If they can sell 10 a year, maybe you're making money, because that $150,000 is just your revenue. It's not your net income or anything like that. So do the math, make sure you factor these things in. If anybody has more questions on this, I can get into it. Another part of the business plan is focusing on what departments you're going to have. As technologists, we want to focus on what product we're going to build, but it's important to focus on how we're going to deliver it too. And my strong recommendation is start with sales. If you haven't sold your product, don't build it. Sell it manually first without any code written. And in a good strategy for this is to launch your Moqui demo server, your Moqui server, and just demo the features that exist out of the box. So if you're trying to build like a agreement management, sales order, and invoicing system, demo everything that exists out of the box. There's already sales orders, there's projects, and there's all that. You can just demo it right out of the box. We did this to banks a lot. Inside of Moqui, there's a report builder hidden down in there. And if you haven't seen the report builder, take a look at it. But countless customers, I demoed the report builder, and it didn't really make the life a day. None of them used it, but they all said, like, do I have the ability to make reports? Yeah, exactly. You check a box. Did I have the ability to make reports on the fly? Yes, you do. You have the ability to make reports on the fly. And so understanding the complete suite of features that are there in Moqui and being able to sell everyone as it exists without any modification is a way to really accelerate your ability to sell people. The second department that you want to think about is your technology department. And there's a quote from, I think his name's Brian Armstrong from Coinbase, is that they're either a hell yeah or they're a no. And so in your technology department, you want to really think about not trying to fill headcount, but trying to bring along people that are going to provide value. I would say most of the developers, and I'll explain our strategy of developers in another slide a little bit, but most of the developers contributed very little to the overall value of our product. And only a handful of them really had super focus, busted out a lot of code and understood what we were building and did like 80 to 90% of the whole project. So finding people that get it, have the skill, and are committed to your company in the technology department is critical. If you turn over a lot of technology people, it's very hard to keep your momentum and keep things going. And the third department to think about is product delivery. And so how are you going to deliver this product to your customers? The product may deliver itself, and that's great, but somebody still needs to explain to the customer how to use it. The product may explain to the customer how to use it, but somebody still has to explain how to use the explanation or the documentation. And so thinking that the technology is just going to deliver itself does happen. Tons of big companies do it, but it rarely happens for startups. Often with startups, you need to deliver that technology to your customer and talk to your customer and actually deliver it. And so my point here is also that you shouldn't have a finance department, you shouldn't have an HR department, and there's a bunch of other departments that you should not have, because you need to do that yourself and you need to be competent enough to run HR for 10 people as a startup. And the next part here, and I'll show a little more on this next screen, is building your financial model. And so this kind of goes back to the customer acquisition cost versus lifetime value. This is a kind of real messy view of something if you don't know what you're looking at. But on the left hand side, there's like financial products. These are not your typical products like a shoe or something. These are loan products, and so they have different characteristics than a shoe. But every product has something that you're going to sell it for, and then it has costs, and then it has the cost of delivering those. And so as you build out a financial model, you want to put all these variables into a spreadsheet somewhere and start playing with them and forecasting them out. And so on the left-hand side is, 4 products, a 3DI24. What the heck's a 3DI24? DI stands for deferred interest. So it's a type of financial product, and there's all these variables that affect that product's performance over time. If you're a hosting company, let's say in Vince's case, like you want to host project management or billing software, you would have different products within that group. And if you only have one product, that's okay. But if you can take that product and have some add-ons that contribute additional revenue to that main product, that's way better. Customers do like choice. They like to buy less and be able to add on over time. And so even if you have one kind of plan for what you're going to build, you ultimately will be able to carve out several different products. And if you're not focusing on products, you're not focusing on customers. You need to sell products to customers, period. That's why it's called Pop Commerce. On the right-hand side, there's a forecast. On the top, there's different activity measures. So what is going to happen within my business? I'm going to sell a certain amount per month. I'm going to have certain employees. I'm going to have different characteristics. If you're not really like kind of thinking about this conceptually, it's hard to manage it over time. On the lower half, there's, just forecasted revenues. This is one snapshot. This is like probably 1/40th of a financial model as a snapshot. So if anybody is really curious about financial modeling, feel free to pick my brains. I'm happy to jumpstart anybody. But it is, my main point here is it's important to think about this and forecast in the future. You can have a great idea. If you don't realize, really think about how you're going to make money off of it in the future, it's very hard to grow it. And it's very hard to get other people to believe in it and work with you on it. They want to see where you're going and know that you know where you're going. Any questions about that? And people are like, we don't care about financial models. We care about technology.
Question. I don't know if it is necessarily the intent of why you even put this top on here, but I think it's great. And it's more along the lines of what assumptions you make and how you project in the future, especially if you're at zero, starting with zero.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this model, and I could show it a little bit more later, we do use sensitivity factors. And so you just kind of first you have to start with your product. You have to know what your product is, what you're going to sell it for, at least assume what you're going to sell it for, and the components of how you deliver it and the costs of those. So those are the first assumptions. The second assumption is the customer base. How big is your market? And I'll do a little.
I think that's the answer though, in terms of especially if you're starting from zero.
Yeah.
It sounds like the answer is basically it gets into that total addressable market kind of conversation, what's your target market? Which one of those customers can you go? And you have to start making some assumptions about what you can charge and how fast you can acquire customers.
Yep, exactly. Let me see, is it this model? I think I got to get a different model, but the way we did it is we looked at the total addressable market, and I'll give MK's example. So the total addressable market for banks and credit unions is about 9,000 banks and credit unions in the country. And then we kind of factored that down and said, well, there's probably only 40% of those that would ever buy our product. That's the only, and we called that the addressable market. So there's the total market, then the addressable market was that 40%. Then we took that 40%, we said, okay, we want to sell a certain percentage of that every month and a fraction of it, super fraction, and kind of played with that and then added sensitivity factors. I have a financial model that I could show you the pieces of that really easy.
One of the big deals there is identifying what is the low-hanging fruit for your particular solution. If you identify what your customers' pain points are and what you can best solve for them, then you can identify the people that are most likely to bite at the solution that you're proposing. And then of course you go about testing that process, right?
Yep. And all of this business side ideally is started or somewhat MVP stage before you write any code. You've thought about this, and it's okay to write some code and test some stuff and have some fun. But if you don't really think about these things, the writing the code part kind of gets you in a loop a little bit for too long. All right. So the next part of this business side is knowing your business process story. And most of what's on the screen here is quoted directly from a book called Holistic Enterprise Mechanization Process by David Jones. I hope I'm not plagiarizing here, David. But the main concept is that it's important to write your requiremends and not start with how you're going to design it. And by design, it's both a technical, back end, we're going to have this service, this data model, those are design. And then the UI design is also design. And so it's important to specify who, what, and when things are going to happen in your business process story. And I'm not going to read all this. You can read it if you want. But I can't stress how much time was wasted talking about how things should look versus how they should work. And if you can really focus on how they should work and who needs to do what, you can get going a lot faster than arguing about the CSS formatting or like, this column's not big enough or these fields aren't aligned, that kind of stuff. It provides later value to the overall usability of the product, but it doesn't provide much initial value. And so catchphrase, if you can't describe it, you can't provide it. And this is kind of critical. A lot of people like to start without describing their business process. So I just want to emphasize, describe it. And there's a very specific way of describing it. I'm going to show you on the next slide. So the last point here, business process story to feature tasks and project management system, is write your business process story, and then those literally become your tasks. Each sentence of your business process story becomes your task, something to build, and then you augment it. You may have additional items that don't fit into your business process story that are tasks, but most of those will be related to some part of your business process story. If you're like scratching your head going, what the heck are you talking about? This is what I'm talking about. So on the left-hand side is a business process story example. And for Resist, we have, this is the top part of it. I can provide the rest of it if anybody's interested. But we have actors. So within this whole thing, we want to define all of the different actors that are going to participate in our product and our consumption of our product. And then on the bottom side of the left-hand story, we have our top level story. And these are all sentences that describe an actor doing actions. And it's color coded based off of our MVP versus future roadmap stuff. So things in red, we weren't even going to try to attempt in our MVP. Things in blue are already done. And then there were other things that we were working on in progress. And so this is kind of like a quasi project management tool where we're saying, okay, we're going to focus on this. And this helps us really prioritize things and make sure that we're working on features to get to market. On the right-hand side, on the top part, is a Moqui project management or task management queue list screen. And you can see under the first one, it says client contracts, talent for project position. That is a literal sentence from our business process story that we copied from our business process story into a task description. And then if you look in the right-hand side, it gets really small over there. But we linked back to this story so that we could go back and forth between the story and our tasks. And then as you add detail to the task, you can add that in the project management system, not in your business process story. The top level business process story is excellent for providing to anybody who you're trying to explain your business to, because you keep it real top level. It doesn't have a lot of details. It has no fields in it. It has very little explanation of how it's going to happen. It's just actors doing actions. And so to non-technical people, it's very easy to read and understand what is going to go on in your company or what you can imagine. Just want to reiterate, if you ever want to read Hemp's a great book. I've read it more than 5 times. You can read it on a 2-hour plane ride. So it's very short, very condensed, and very easy to read. And I recommend it. Hopefully we see some more book sales. And David can also send it out digitally if you hate books.
Yeah, if anyone wants it, that's fine. One thing I should note real quick while you're in sort of a pause here, Gurudaram, is excuse me, like this approach, especially for smaller teams, works really well, going directly from the requirements in the form of a business process story to taskifying. Sometimes for larger teams or more complex projects, it's worth going through the design phase that the Hemp book talks about, and then taskify based on the designs as opposed to taskifying based on the requirements. I don't know if you're going to mention that, but I thought I'd interject that real quick. So
yeah, I think I haven't worked with big enough teams, but to see the utility of it, but or enough full-time architects is more what I mean.
That helps. Yeah. When you get into technical designs and stuff, sometimes to keep everything consistent, doing technical design as well as UI design and other things. Yeah, for sure.
And again, kind of the main point here is the whole ecosystem of kind of this belief system of write out what you need as requirements and then get it into your project management system versus oftentimes if you have a project management system and you hire a project manager, they'll meet with developers and the developers will tell them all this detailed stuff that they need to do, but it doesn't really keep focus on the high level objectives that you're trying to achieve. Any other questions about business process story slide here? All right. For a lean startup, you must be agile. And the most important thing for agile for me is that software exists, get into production. Or said even more extremely, free software exists, get it into production. And so just kind of reiterating this, the first thing you want to do is set up your server, your Moqui server that's running Moqui, and say, I currently have a product in market. And yes, you did copy all the Moqui software, and yes, you own it all immediately. It is your product that you can sell. So get it into production or quote unquote production, be able to demo it like as fast as you can and know that you can just start demoing right away. And I think that a lot of people don't take this sincerely enough that the moment you copy the Moqui code, you can own it and you can use it and you can demo it and you can sell it and all that kind of stuff. And it will really speed up your ability to get out there by just copying stuff and launching versus trying to focus on all the things you have to build in order to get an MVP going. The second part for me in Agile is continuous improvement and deployment. And they're two separate concepts. On continuous improvement, there's a commitment to continually improve your software. And that's either delivering new features, enhancing features, or making it easier to use one way or another. And if you're not doing that every single week, you are not going to get ahead. Like you must improve your system every week. First, you have to have something there, then you got to improve it every single week. And to facilitate this, it's really important to create a deployment system that's very easy to use. I think Michael will eventually document and release some stuff on how our CI/CD pipeline works. But we use GitHub Actions, which because it's a public repository are free, and that builds the image, it pushes it to Amazon ECR and updates the Amazon ECS task definition. It kicks off a new task, and voila, we have the new code in production. Just a click of a button. So my main thing here is you should not have to use your terminal to deploy very much. You should be able to commit and push a button, and it should kick in a process and get it out there for you. And if you're not there, again, we're here to help as a community and get you there. Any questions on, I think most people in the room are doing this, but is there anybody out there not doing continuous deployment, meaning they're having a tough time getting their servers updated? Nope. All
I
right,
think that's something we could use some improvement in. This is really good stuff, Guru Drum.
thanks. And this third one hopefully is a controversial topic, but I want to emphasize that as a startup, especially if you're a non-programming founder, it's important to measure commits. And you want to literally track how many commits happened on your repo or your component every week and identify that. The reason for this is if there are no commits on your repo in a week, you failed. Absolutely. You had a week of work or no work. You don't know what happened, so you failed. Small commits are great. Big commits are okay. Small commits are easy to look at what's going on. They're easy to QA. They're easier to peer review and all that kind of stuff. Big commits change a lot of things all at once, and it's often very hard to know what exactly is getting affected. And so if you measure commits, and this is a developer room, and developers may not like saying, how many commits did I get out this week and feeling that pressure. But as a startup, if you measure commits and you don't necessarily want them to grow. You want them to be manageable relative to the number of developers you have. So you want to look for that key number, but it'll help you identify people's workflow. And it's very often hard to identify developer workflow any other way. Like, it's very hard to know what they're doing if you don't really do the development yourself, specifically. The fourth point of Agile is brutal prioritization. So identify your MVP, cut out everything possible. So an MVP, it took me a long time to understand that the minimum viable product, the word minimum was put there first for a reason. And the reason is it's really easy to add features to a product. It's really easy to just keep saying, well, what about this? This would make it a little better. Let's add this and this and this and this. And you really want to deliver as little as possible continuously. So you want to kind of identify that MVP, deliver it as fast as possible, and you can only do that through brutal prioritization. Any comments?
What's your testing process look like? Are you testing on a separate implementation? Are you how is that working?
Yeah, and it's definitely different. So it depends on the phase of your company. If you have no active users, then you should test on your production server. And you should test by deploying to production. So preface, no active users, right? If you have no active users, you should deploy to your production server and you should test it yourself so that you know your product. If you have active users, and I think Eamon could speak more to this, or anybody else could speak more to it, but and we just had this conversation, David. I think if you require very advanced testing systems to catch problems, you have a problem with your developers, and you have to identify and acknowledge that. So it is good to have testing. In Microsoft's terms, the best testers are your customer. They're going to tell you your problems, right? So,
Follow that.
and I somewhat follow it too. As a startup, you don't have enough real time or money to slow down your product or spend it on a lot of testing. And so at some point you do just kind of got to push and see where the problems are. And if you have a pretty much any CI/CD pipeline, you'll be able to revert a commit very easy. Like in AWS, in Amazon ECS, we have task definitions, and those task definitions could be directly associated with an ECR image. And so it could be as easy as just saying, hey, go back to this task definition, and then it'll just automatically launch a good working version of the code base. So you want to have that. Anybody else want to chime in good testing, or anybody feel like they do? I don't feel like I do adequate testing except for myself. I test the system 100%.
Yeah, one quick thought on that, like I believe in the idea, and that tends to work out very well over time, and making developers responsible for what they deliver. So if they mess something up and it goes into production, then they're responsible for fixing it with support as needed. So that's a management responsibility, is make sure they have the support as needed, make sure there's someone to review things with them, make sure they understand it, and the fix is well done. But then also make them responsible. Like if they mess up a bunch of data, like they add code that messes up a bunch of data, then they need to be responsible. Again, likely working with someone else who will support them as needed to fix all of that. So, and that over time helps developers get kind of more grounded in reality and understand the consequences of the code changes they're making, so they are more careful in the future and such. So anyway, that's one little side thought there.
Yeah, definitely.
Even if we do have customers that are hitting the production circuit, and you deploy to a separate staging server, most customers is they're not even considering that. They're only going to use where their data has already been entered on production. And so they won't even bother hitting staging.
Yeah.
And we've had that happen lots of times. We've done all of our testing and develop, push it to staging. We say, please test it.
Yeah.
And it's complete silence. And then when it goes to production, then what David said, everything hits the fan.
Yep.
Or it looks great.
Yeah, it looks great.
They'll say, it looks great, and they never
Yeah.
actually click the link you sent them.
Yeah.
Now, I would say, like, maybe you can comment on this. Let's say you're adding a feature and the feature changes things about the transactions, that get stored in the database. And you deploy it and you find the problem in production, but now you've got data that can't be run on the previous version, essentially. How do you deal with that? And especially maybe you have been a mix of, good transactions and now transactions that if you roll your feature back, they aren't compatible.
I'll answer it two ways, okay? The first way isn't going to quite answer it, so I'll preface it. It's not quite answering it, but one way to avoid that is to not invent data models. So in the beginning of MK, we invented all of our data models. And like we first used .NET, invented our data models. Then we used a whole TypeScript backend, invented all of our data models. Then we got into Moqui and invented a bunch of data models. And those are the bane of Eamon's existence. You can see Eamon's face, right? The bane of your existence. So if you can really hunker into universal data models and then rarely and only in very architected ways add to those data models, you'll have less of a problem of what you're saying. So it doesn't quite answer it. I haven't actually, I think what David said is if you make the developer that messes things up, fix the data in production, which happens sometimes, then you can do it. I don't have a ton of experience with it though. Yeah.
It's a tough question. Like, I mean, sometimes you do make so much of a mess that you can't really roll back the code. You have to either disable certain parts of the system temporarily, and then you just, pull in the people necessary to cram on it until you get it to an operable state again. But sometimes, yeah, if you mess up enough, it's there's no way but forward. You have to then plan carefully and figure out how you're going to get to a clean state again, an operable state again.
Another way of asking what you're saying is, let's say that you roll code and the new code changes things so that something breaks. One of the things that you want to try to build into the system, and system messages can do this really great for integrations, is you want to build things in that will store the data even if the transaction fails. So if you're getting like a system message, if you can store it, you can store it and the transaction fails because the code broke it, then you can roll back the code, rerun the system messages, and resume from there. So if you can build in some way to store the request of a transaction, then even if the transaction fails, you can resume from it. That saved our butt a lot of times, several different times. In MK, we were taking in quote unquote orders for ordering new financial products like deposits or loans. And we lost very few orders, but we messed a ton up. So we had a system for when somebody submitted a new order, it would just get stored in a system message. And so several times the code would break the whole process of what that was supposed to happen, but we had it in the system message. We were able to fix the code, resume it. And even though people were frustrated, they weren't pulling their hair because it still worked. Yeah.
They didn't get dropped on the floor.
They didn't get, yeah. Right. And then AWS RDS has, if you click a box, backups, automatic backups. There was like one time it was so bad we just went to a backup, and we were taking real frequent snapshots. So we lost like 30 minutes of data or something, but it wasn't like crazy. Great questions. I also did notice on this diagram the arrows are pointing the wrong way. So they're pointing exactly the opposite way. So you want to go from plan to code to build, test, release, deploy, operations, monitor, back to planning. I don't know. Bad copying on my part. All right. Kind of one more point here, a couple more points. For the team for a lean startup, you really have to consider whether you're going to train or hire experienced people. And my point here is either way, you're going to have to train them. So identifying the Moqui training tools that you're going to use and putting those in new hires' faces aggressively or in even recruiting processes is extremely important. For MK, for developers, we made them build a specific component in Moqui as their testing for applying for a position. So we gave them a whole test scenario and we said, here's Moqui, provide us a component and a gist that will achieve these objectives using, and you're going to be graded on using as little code as possible. That's the grading mechanism. And so it weeded out everybody that didn't want to learn Moqui immediately, which was great. And the people that really got excited and really used the component and understood what it was about succeeded. One of the people Eamon works with, his name's Amir, maybe you'll meet him, really like kind of just took this on and gave me the best presentation of my whole life. And he was like, this is what Moqi's about. It's about providing all this stuff for you up front. I have very little code here. Here you are. I'm going to demo it. And boom. And then he's succeeded ever since. So you want to kind of think that you're going to have to train developers regardless on Moqui. You're going to have to explain that you're going to use this ecosystem, whether they're new hires or experienced people. And so rather than just assuming you can hire experienced people, you still got to think like, I got to train them on this. I got to explain that we are using this data model. We are using a service-oriented architecture. We are using Java. We are using all these tools. We are using free marker templates. You know, people look at those and go, what the heck is this? I've never heard of this. You got to just explain like, this is where it is and go to this website if you want to learn more about it. That kind of goes into this next point. And we had a lot of difficulty with this because I'm not a programming founder, is forcing your developers to commit to your software stack. People generally, talk about this in the next slide, but people generally want to use what they know how to use or what they think will get them paid more in the future. And so you want to just tell them you have to commit to the software stack, you have to use it. And if they argue with you, fire them fast, like just get rid of them. They're not worth it. I've had good experience with consultants because the consultants that we've hired, David, Michael, to some extent, we're always focused on work that's right ahead of us and not ever delivering like a $50,000 project. So I wouldn't hire a Moqui consultant, no offense to anybody on this call, but for $50,000 for all these features, because in reality, in an agile development, things change all the time. And so it's better to kind of like look at your consultants, make sure they understand what you're building conceptually, and then get them started with you. And then if you have to stop it at some point, make sure that you're comfortable enough to talk to them and say like, hey, I need a pause because I don't know what I'm doing, or I need a pause because I don't have money, or I need a pause because you're not doing enough. You know, just really manage your consultants here. And final point here on the team is that in my strong belief, I couldn't stress this enough, any company that wants to use Moqui needs to have a technical founder. I consider myself a technical founder, even though I don't program. And what I mean by that is some founder on the team needs to fully understand the data model that you use. They need to understand the reason you're using Moqui and the infrastructure that you use. I recently heard a horror story about a company, and this was like a kind of community friend of mine, and he was trying to hire me, and he was like, you know, our employee left, our servers aren't running, and I don't know what to do. He's like, and I was like, okay, what are you running your servers on? And he's like, I don't know. I said, all right, you need to look at your AWS bill and see what you're running your servers on, and then see what your code base is in, and then find somebody that can do that, because I can't do any of that. And if you don't have a founder that holds on to that knowledge, it's very hard to keep your product in motion, keep it going for very long. So can't emphasize that enough. Sorry for taking too much time. We're almost wrapped up here. All right, a couple of quick lessons learned, and then I'm going to hand it over to Eamon for some more lessons learned. These are tough lessons learned. Framework of the day mostly improves junior developer skills. And so what I mean by this is when we started off, we hired junior developers because that's what we could find for what we wanted to pay them. And they were interested in learning .NET or React or TypeScript and building everything from scratch. And some of them were, you know, genius, brilliant people, but it didn't really benefit us as a company because it really just created this independent siloed project that they worked hard on, and it did something great, but it didn't last in production over time for our customers. And so it's important to kind of just stick to your guns here. If you're going to use Moqui, use it as much as possible and stick to it. Don't let people tell you we should use this tool, that tool, and add it all. Just find out how to implement it natively and directly and stick to it. Second point here, kind of reiterated all these, but just reiterate them. Looks don't matter if it can't walk. So make sure you focus on your data model first, your functionality second, and UI design a distant tenth. There's a bunch of things before that that you'll figure out. So don't let people over UI design your product and really be picky about it. It's okay to have a very like simple, high level Figma or something like that if you need it, but it's much better to know your business process story, the data model that you're going to put in there, and the fields you're going to put on screen before you talk about what color or what shape of box or anything like that, and how you're going to present that stuff. Next point is brutal prioritization. So deliver one feature at a time per person and make sure they finish it if they're a developer or if it's yourself. Don't let them take on 2 or 3 things at a time. Take one, deliver one. Take one, deliver one. Take one, deliver one. And make sure that that thing is the most important thing for your customer that you're going to deliver next. Don't let them get distracted on cool things or fun things. It's very important to corral your team, your coworkers, your consultants, everybody to get your business process story delivered to your customer. And final point here, transitioning to new software is always a challenge for your customer, for your team, for everybody. And so you just got to commit to it, get people on the right page, keep them motivated, and keep going. I'll hand it over to Eamon. I'll mute Eamon.
Could you keep the screen though?
Yeah. Should be good.
You good? Okay, great. So a few lessons from from my previous experiences. So firstly, the most important lesson I would share with everyone is be conscious about what you're getting yourself into. One of the biggest dreads we have nowadays is the media controls everything. So you open YouTube, for example, and you see all of these great success stories of people that started with $20 and $100 and $2,000, and they had those immensely successful businesses, and they made tons of money out of them. But for each successful story, you don't see the hundreds and thousands of failed successful stories. The media has no interest in showing you those. So you have to be very conscious about what you're doing and what you want when you want to basically become an entrepreneur and have your own business. Secondly, you should keep a possibility of failure. So be ready to fail. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your whole business is going to fail. But some ideas that you come up with may not be the optimal ideas. Then commercial software isn't necessarily better. Like I remember when I started my own business, I had the idea that since Jira was a commercial software, it's better than Redmine. Some stupid ideas that you have when you're young. So you need, as Gurdara mentioned, you need to cut down costs as much as possible in your early days. Then you need to come up with ideas to measure your progress. There's a book actually called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and he calls it innovation accounting. So if you're starting your business, you need to be a master at bookkeeping. Simple stuff. How much money you spent this month, how much time did you put into this feature. All these data are called bookkeeping, and you can use them for different types of accounting. And in the book, innovation accounting is described as the formula you come up with to determine whether a feature that you're working on is successful or not. Okay, because as I mentioned earlier, not every idea you're going to come up with is going to achieve the goal. And then don't be stubborn. When you look at the data and the data is telling you that you're not going in the right direction, don't be stubborn. Okay, you have to pivot and you have to pick a new strategy when your current strategy is not working. Once you become an expert at recording and having innovative accounting and then pivoting, you become a master at becoming an entrepreneur, basically. And the best analogy I like in the book, the Lean Startup book, is they say, drive a car and don't launch a rocket. And the explanation behind this sentence is, when you drive a car, if you miss a turn, you can just correct it in the next turn. Very simple, no major catastrophes. Whereas if you're launching a rocket and you have half a degree of wrong calculation, your whole mission is going to be a catastrophic failure. The rocket is going to miss its destination. And look at the immense money and effort that you just wasted because of that one calculation. So it's good to have a goal. Nobody's saying start a business without even having a goal. On the contrary, but make decisions every day, and pivot and make it feel much more like driving a car as opposed to launching a rocket. I hope you find these simple lessons valuable in your day-to-day dealings with your business. Any questions?
Not sure if we have time for questions. We should move on to the next one.
Great stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you, Guru Dharam and Eamon. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now, and